Okay, all right. Okay, great. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. Welcome to Why Africa's COP Matters. Over the next hour, we're going to be discussing the significance of COP27. COP27, of course, being the UN climate conference that is taking place in Sharm El-Sheikh, Egypt, kicks off on Sunday, November 6th, and it runs through to November 18th. The occasion has been widely dubbed as Africa's COP. The implication is obvious. Because the gathering is taking place in an African country, the idea is that this is an opportunity for the continent to push its climate agenda and to influence the global debate on climate action. That sounds good, but we kind of want to put that to the test here, because just because we have the world in an African country doesn't mean that Africa takes center stage, right? The power dynamics are the same. And it isn't a given that this is an opportunity for Africa's priorities to take center stage vis-a-vis climate change. And that's really the crux of what we want to get at is this an opportunity for Africa to push its climate agenda? And if it is, how does it go about it? For me, the real question is this Africa's COP, or is this simply COP taking place in Africa? We're going to look at three main themes in this regard. The first is that big question of why Africa's COP matters, or indeed if it does. The second is the energy transition. We all know that is one of the biggest issues right now globally, and it's taking on additional urgency given events this year in Europe, which we are all very familiar with. And last but not least, we're going to be looking at the ever-present issue of the money, because financing has been one of the main sticking points around climate negotiations for many years, and it is a theme that comes up time and time again vis-a-vis the extent to which Africa can actually do anything about the effects of climate change. Those are three broad areas. We'll see how the discussion evolves. Those are kind of our touch points, but we have four experts here with us to delve deeper into this by way of a very quick introduction. We have Kimberly Botwright, who is the head of sustainable trade at the World Economic Forum. Sanjeev Gupta, who is executive director for financial services at the Africa Finance Corporation. Yaron Ristad, who is the CEO of Ristad Energy. And we have Elise Leroux, who is a senior researcher in African Futures in the African Futures and Innovation Program at the Institute for Security Studies. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. Very much looking forward to your perspectives. Before we get into the actual discussion, just a reminder to everyone who's dialed in, all the participants, please submit any comments or questions you have through the Q&A box. I'm sure by now you've all been through plenty of Zoom calls, so you'll know how this works. And we'll do our best to include your perspectives in the conversation as well. Okay. Now, in terms of structure, we're going to do this in two parts. Part one is a brief round where I'm going to ask you for your quick takes on the main issue that we're talking about today, which is why Africa's COP matters, or indeed whether it does. I'm going to give you 2 minutes each to just give us your sort of high-level perspective. What are some of the most important issues here? Why should we care about this? And specifically from an African perspective, should we care more that COP27 is happening on the continent than we should about other COPs, which sort of rotate around the world? Sanjeev, would you mind if I come to you first? My only advice to all of you, okay, so I'm gonna be strict on the 2-minute time limit. All I'll say is don't hold back with your perspectives, please. We want to have a healthy, honest conversation here. And Sanjeev, from experience, I believe you need no encouragement there. So why don't you kick us off? 2 minutes. Why does Africa's COP matter?
Yeah, so Leonard, thank you very much. I think any conference or any event which brings together global decision makers to discuss what is global issues is important, right? Now, it so happens, as you know, that this is going to happen in an African city, in an African country. So you're kind of trying to put an angle to it, saying that therefore, why is it important for Africa? I mean, it's important for Africa regardless of where it happens, right? And to that extent, it's a bit of an academic issue where it's hosted. However, as we know, the continent tends to be either misunderstood or not understood at all. It depends on which part of that range you go into. And often the narrative on the continent, the realities of the continent, the actual challenges of the continent is interpreted wrongly or geopolitically deprioritized vis-a-vis other pressing matters that dominates global leadership. So my hope is, without trying to exceed your 2 minutes, is that because it's being hosted here, the issues are obvious. Africa is disproportionately, as you know, affected by the climate change, while it is not the one which lit the fire, as we know. Africa didn't light the fire, but we seem to be getting doused in it. So the discussion that I would like to have is to understand what will make the world understand that the climate change realities are the same everywhere. But in the case of this continent, given the legacies, given the realities, how can we nuance the approach? Because it's actually quite funny. The name is COP, and in many ways, it's been a cop out by the people who matter as far as the African agenda is concerned, and that's why it's important. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 minutes on the dot. Incredible. Great start there, Sanjeev. Thanks so much. You've touched on already a number of key issues. One word I want to pick on right now is narrative, because that is an issue that is really emerging as one of the problems vis-a-vis Africa. It is portrayed often, usually as just a sort of passive victim of climate change, not much it can do about it. And I would say one of the important things that should be addressed is this issue of narrative. Does Africa actually have more agency than we give it credit for? But we will build on that. Kimberly, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn to you next. In your 2 minutes, what would you like to focus on or highlight vis-a-vis COP27? Why does it matter? Why does it matter specifically for Africa?
Thanks. So I'd really like to build on what Sanjeev just said. I was nodding as he spoke. It matters so much for Africa, not because it's taking place in Africa, but because they are so impacted by climate change, which is all the more reason to bring forward their perspectives. And I think the point that Sanjeev made, that unfortunately when it does happen elsewhere, the perspectives of African economies can be geopolitically deprioritized. But actually, when we look at the region, when we look at what they're doing in terms of the integration, I come at this from a trade and investment perspective, Africa is now home to one of the world's largest free trade agreements. That is incredibly exciting. That is a big source of future growth opportunity. We need to make sure that that growth opportunity is also green, that it drives growth opportunities and allows African economies to integrate into the green value chains of the future. And so I think that the fact that this is the COP is happening in Egypt gives an opportunity to bring forward both the growth story as well as the dealing with the impacts of climate change. Because I think we underestimate how much is happening on the continent, how much excitement there is, and entrepreneurship. But that has to be an entrepreneurship that is green, and that has to, these economic opportunities have to be part of the low carbon transition, as much as we also have to talk about climate impacts and dealing with those. So I really hope that we can have that perspective coming through at this COP as well.
Great, thank you, Kimberly. So deprioritization of Africa, echoing what Sanjeev said, and the need to basically get past that, understand, first of all, the extent to which Africa is being impacted. But I really like your point around the green growth opportunity, which is something that is often underestimated. And in terms of low carbon growth, there's a increasingly compelling argument that Africa is actually one of the best suited parts of the world if you are looking for low carbon growth and green growth. So that's something that we're going to get into later on for sure, especially because we're going to be looking specifically at the energy transition, which of course is highly relevant in that respect. Yarant, over to you. In your 2 minutes, what would you like to highlight?
Yeah, over the recent weeks and months, I've had the pleasure to discuss this with quite some politicians in Africa. And as some of you already have pointed on, you know, the narrative seems to be that, well, we have hardly any emissions from Africa, and the rest of the world has made a problem. For us, we are the victims, so no, you need to fix it. But we in Africa can focus on continuing to use, for example, fossil fuel, because in any case, it doesn't matter too much. And we deserve to do that, and you need to clean up in your backyard. That is basically the main narrative I've heard. I think it's one big misunderstanding in this, because I agree that Africa should go for the cheapest energy solutions for the future. But what is the case now is that renewable energy, most places are cheaper, more efficient to develop, and the total cost, as I mentioned, is cheaper. So it is actually a benefit for Africa to be able to leapfrog several of the generations of fossil fuel and go directly to solar, wind plus batteries and distributed network. So I think it's a great opportunity there. Also, I see a lot of opportunities for Africa for example, to be hosting the industrial hubs of tomorrow, which will be desert areas near the coast, like whether it's in Mauritania or in Namibia or a lot of other places. You can build super giant renewable solar and wind farms to be the future production hubs for metals, chemistry, you know, fertilizers, etc. So I think it's a lot of opportunities there. But I'm a little bit surprised about the kind of hesitation to want to invest in renewable energy in Africa that I met among quite some of the leaders. So hopefully this COP will, from being in Africa, also create more attention on the technology opportunities that we see.
Great, thank you, Jan. Very important perspective there on the issue you're describing is what's often referred to as the just transition for Africa. That's the sort of the argument, right? That we didn't, as Sanjeev said, we didn't light the fire. Now you're telling us we can't use our fossil fuels. But very, very significantly there is the misconception that fossil fuels are actually cheaper, not only in terms of investing now, but of course the long-term implications of going deeper into fossil fuels now when the rest of the world is transitioning away, right? And I really like the sort of call to action. You know, why not look at Africa as the place to set up industrial hubs of tomorrow? I think that's a great way of positioning it, and something we will definitely look into. Also interesting to hear that you've been met with a lot of hesitation to promote renewable energy, and hopefully that's something we can shift the needle on. Finally, Elise, over to you. What would you like to add to the conversation at this point?
Okay, so I agree with Gerard that there's lots of possibilities and opportunities. We are seeing that currently the global geopolitical tension is threatening the climate agenda. We are seeing countries reverting on their fossil commitments, and large-scale adaptation projects, they do remain still very sparse. So we are living in what we call a divided world. 2 weeks ago, we released a report that modeled the impacts of this divided world on Africa. This is a world where the tension between these big global players, like what we're seeing now, are not being negotiated. You know, there's no meaningful reduction in carbon emissions. And in this world, the impact on Africa would mean that we'll see an increase in poverty by as much as 48% within the next couple of decades. It will also impact the economy of Africa, making it much less growth potential and severely constraining that. And of course, you know, an increase in poverty will mean people will have less ability to withstand natural hazards. So this divided world, we also argue, and this lack of growth in Africa will hamper Africa to meet its development challenges. So food and energy security being two of these pressing challenges. So Africa, I think, has much more to lose than any other region. So the African negotiators really in this COP should be very motivated, more than ever before, to highlight this unjust nature of the impacts. And I really think to push for targeted support and to hold countries accountable to their pledges. So there's a lot going on globally, but COP really provides an opportunity to refocus the world's attention away from all of what's going on onto the climate crisis. And I think it's happening on a continent where we experience loss and damages daily. So, but it's also a continent with a lot of growing and development potential, emerging markets. So it's an opportunity for African countries to influence the proceedings and to also push their agenda and to put it on the table. And yeah, I agree with what Jaron said.
Thank you, Kimberly. We've all of course seen this year the significance of the geopolitical fallout from what is happening in Ukraine at the moment, and part of that, as we have witnessed, is a lot of European countries are now flocking to Africa to try and sort of hurriedly sign gas, exploration deals, and sort of up the amount of fossil fuels that they're getting off the continent. And there is the risk of one having a divide and, of course, backsliding in terms of the climate agenda. Obviously, not good news. Okay, so we've established a few things here, that Africa sits in the margins. It shouldn't, in terms of the priorities when it comes to climate action. In principle, we have an opportunity to shift that narrative. There's an underestimation of what Africa, the opportunity that Africa has and presents, not just for itself, but globally, in terms of renewables. And Yaron, you used the term leapfrogging, which is, I think, an interesting notion, one that I suspect if you circulate that globally, a lot of people would kind of raise their eyebrow at the idea that, Africa, which currently can't supply 600 million of its people with energy, how is it suddenly going to become this leader in terms of new technologies and new sources of energy? But we've seen before the potential for that to happen in mobile telecoms. Of course, that's the big story we all know. So it is theoretically possible, at least. Now, let's expand this conversation a little bit, sticking to this theme of why Africa's Cup matters and how to get the most out of this opportunity. And Sanjeev, if I could turn to you to start on this point, it's kind of clear, right? What needs to happen is, well, and I had a conversation with someone about this the other day, and she said to me, well, if we show up at COP, we being Africa, then we can do something. We can get the world to pay a little bit more attention, shift the narrative. But how do you actually go about that? Because if you ask me today, what is Africa's position vis-a-vis the global climate debate and climate action, I wouldn't really be able to give you an answer. Is there, when we go to COP27, how important is it that there's some sort of, united front here, some sort of consistency across the African continent, which, from what I can tell, isn't really there. What you have is a lot of markets that are kind of heading in different directions. Do you see it that way? Do you see it differently? And, the core question, how does Africa, as this, sort of amorphous concept, go about shifting the narrative and changing this idea that, well, it just doesn't matter?
So, let me kind of create a few misconceptions here. I don't think the continent at any stage, either voluntarily or involuntarily, or even has the luxury for that matter, to reject the climate debate. Because unlike most continents or most parts of the world, an average person is directly affected and being affected in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of their ability to grow food, in terms of simply having homes that don't get submerged or destroyed, or even to be able to transport themselves from one point to the other. That's how millions or billions of Africans in Africa are dependent on nature, and therefore the nature's fallouts affect them much, much, much more. So there is no question in the eyes and minds of the African leadership the need to fight climate change. So for starters, I would like your audience to accept that nobody is trying to create a narrative which is scientifically not founded or in reality not justified. We are all supportive. In fact, AFC as an institution has been doing tremendous work on the renewable side. However, what you must understand, and where the narrative or the, let's call it the distrust comes in, is that pledges don't come. Pledges don't arrive. And we are talking about changing and leapfrogging Africa. I love the word leapfrogging because there's another word which uses the word frog in the army parlance. It's called frog marching. And I don't think Africa should be frog marched into something, again, that will be seen as, if not hypocritical, probably some sort of a different agenda. Because the bottom line, Landry, is that today, Africa is home to amazing amount of natural resources to produce renewable energy. So do something about it. Put the money where your mouth is. Let's work with the institutions. Secondly, this whole talk about gas, and I'm going to stop here because obviously there are going to be other opportunities. Gas as a transition fuel has to be accepted, Landry, because today the maximum amount of energy that Africa uses, is what? Is firewood to cook food. So you're basically burning wood, killing trees just to cook food. So gas, with enormous amount of gas that the continent has, for us to stop investing in gas and being able to provide LPG, LNG, CNG is a bizarre concept. It must be taken out from the narrative or the perception that Africa doesn't care. Africa, of course, cares. And the other point I'll make is that for all the reasons that you cited, and I heard Jaron say things like hesitation, that pricing means, it's more cheaper to do renewables than non-renewables. That is great. But Africa also has to find ways of developing its export revenues, has to find ways of creating jobs. So this whole debate about supply chain diversity, about manufacturing things where the raw materials are, let's take them seriously. Let's take them seriously so that you get an industrialization that is based on a renewable agenda. Gas acts as a transition fuel, and Africa industrializes itself and creates the jobs it needs. And that's the debate that I would like to have in Egypt next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. One very quick follow-up. Would you say that you are a proponent of the just transition argument?
Well, I don't know what the word just means, because I have always said that just is what you negotiate, and justice is what the world tries to attempt to get but never gets. So from my point of view, I hate to get into this jargon game of just transition. I'm just going to say what is practical, that there is no energy mix in the world today, 50 years down the line, which does not have fossil fuel in it. I can reel off statistics of how many times there has been toing and froing amongst the global powers on what they want to do with their climate agenda. And we are being caught in the middle of a storm. And as I say, when elephants fight, the grass suffers, and that suffering must stop.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Muted myself. Kimberly, you mentioned earlier, and I'll get some reactions to what you've said, Sanjeev. I think Yaron might want to come back on some of that. But Kimberly, you mentioned earlier the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. In principle, a big opportunity. In practice, how much does that actually change the picture? Has it changed the picture? Because yes, it's big, it's ambitious, but some would argue, and I might be among those, that ambition is kind of problematic in its own right, because integration, as we know, is very limited. But relating to some of the points Sanjeev has made, of course, a more integrated continent makes for a much more compelling investment case. It also makes for a much more compelling argument in terms of driving this idea that Africa can industrialize down a green path. How important is that in the climate debate, and to what extent are we in a position to actually, really talk about an integrated Africa?
Thanks, great question, and that's sort of where I was hoping to come in here. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg. So I think AfCFTA is a fantastic vision. It's a policy-focused discussion. A lot of integration will depend on logistics and infrastructure. We know how challenging that is across the region, which in turn depends on further investment. So an investment in kind then depends on having a stable policy regulatory space. So there is kind of a little bit of a chicken and egg here. So I think the AFCFTA is sending a very good signal. However, when we bring it back to the environment and climate conversation, to your original question at this segment, which is, how much is Africa presenting a united front? I think it is a concern that there isn't an environment chapter yet in the AFCFTA. I think that is something that needs to be considered at some point, maybe not yet, but at some point down the line, that is something that is worth considering if the region is to really promote itself to global investors as being a serious place to invest, to be as for production and consumption that's within a green value chain, because that's the direction that exports are going in. Europe is regulating heavily on the way they want, the sustainability of products that can enter their markets. And so that will therefore impact export from Africa and affect the standards that African suppliers have to meet. So that is something that's worth considering, but as much as it presents a challenge, that's also an opportunity. I also think then we'll come on to talking about financed investment next, but one of the big barriers to investment, particularly in energy and renewables, is again on the regulatory environment and policy certainty, including on climate policies. So again, I think having more certainty in that space and having something like the AFCFTA that has an environment chapter with a certain kind of alignment among the countries and certain commitment to each other as to minimum standards of where they want to see environmental policies vis-a-vis commercial policies would be very helpful signal to investors. And I think that, again, it kind of is a bit of a chicken and egg, because we do need the finance to come in to grow green growth, but we also need that good policy environment to attract it. But again, these are hopefully the types of points that can be made in Sharm El-Sheikh, and that it's not just a conversation that we're having over the geopolitics between the US and China and Asia, but that actually the green growth opportunity and story for Africa is well represented, and that the opportunities are spoken about as much as the challenges.
Thank you, Kimberly. Yaron, back to you. Gas has to be part of the mix. I'm curious to get your take on that. And we've, in principle, I think everyone agrees that in principle, look, the potential for renewable energy and green growth in Africa isn't in dispute. The problem with that debate is that we often get stuck on the potential side. There's potential for a lot of things across Africa, but as Kimberly's just sort of indicated, it's easier said than done, because you do run into obstacles. Some of those are on the policy side, some of those are infrastructure, some of those are lack of human capital, you name it, right? We all know the list. So how do you see this? How would you see this sort of picture of a renewable transformation in Africa unfolding? Like, how realistically ready is the continent for large-scale deployment of capital, but also of projects that can really meaningfully shift the needle vis-a-vis the energy mix on the continent? And also, I would like to repeat, I'd like to get your take on the role of gas in all of this, because that's a big one of the big points that has been made by a lot of African governments, that gas has to absolutely be part of this transition. Yes. Okay. Now, what I'm saying now is based on some very recent kind of publications we are doing on the global energy mix to 2100, where we have developed 12 different scenarios, summing up to from all the temperature degrees from 1.4 degree global warming to 2.5 degree global warming to fit with the UN's or the IPCC's CO2 budgets. And all of these scenarios are delivering all the energy the world is needing sector by sector. But the mix of renewables and the fossil fuel is what is different from these different scenarios. And then we're looking at what is the realism in the different scenarios based on the supply chain's ability to deliver. And the logic is that first you need to deploy solar, wind, batteries, and end users electrified end user applications like the electric vehicle. And then the residual will be filled with fossil fuel. Because the marginal cost of solar, wind, and battery storage will always be much lower than
fossil fuel based. So, I mean, you will never stop a solar plant to let a gas-fired power plant come in. So that what is determining the speed of the energy transition is how fast you can deploy all of this. So we are doing all of these scenarios. And of course, in most of these scenarios, gas is a very important transition fuel because gas can replace coal faster. And gas will still have an important role in the industries and more early meet the competition from renewables in the power generation side. But also in societies that need heating, it makes sense to have gas heating rather than electricity heating until the electricity sector is renewable. So because it's much less losses, heat losses from burning the molecule directly in your house, rather than burning the molecule on a power plant and then transport the electricity to the house, etc. So absolutely gas, we are seeing a growing consumption of global gas, but then a quite quick decline in the 2030s and onwards. So it is a race for the remaining gas resources globally to be brought to a state that where it can be exported globally as LNG, for example. So of course, Mozambique, Tanzania, you know, a lot of East African resources and also some West African resources. Yes, they are still in the money. They can still provide a very important role, but they really need to speed up the development because if you start 10 years from now, it's too late. Then you're coming too late to the party. So absolutely, I believe in this. And of course, we are working a lot with the details on all of these projects and see which of these projects are competitive now to be brought in. So full support to that, but you need to speed up. In terms of export potential, what I think is underestimated is that also these renewable hubs can actually, it's not to make renewables to provide a local community with power. That is not the main purpose, this super giga hubs that I talked about. No, it is to make a new export industry, to make tomorrow's industrial hubs. One concrete example, if you want to look at it, is what Intercontinental Energy is doing in Australia. They're actually now building, they are not yet the final investment decision, but they will build 6,000 square kilometers, 26 gigawatt. That is enormous. That is almost 30 times bigger than the biggest solar plants today. So it's enormous. But they will build that on one location with extreme solar radiation in the day and very strong winds in the night. So we're using both of these resources and have a very steady supply. And it's already attracting ammonia plants, steel plants, aluminum plants, chemical plants. So this will be a new export opportunity. So really, I think that for the next 10 years, yes, Africa can provide important income, export income, natural gas can provide that. But for the coming 2 or 3 decades, renewable can be even more a differentiator in Africa, because Africa is more special on the renewable side in terms of fit for purpose than what it is on the gas side, actually. But these are not very well known technologies and concepts. So that's why really these technologies need to be marketed. But the cost of energy can come down to $20 to $30 per megawatt hour, while for fossil fuel, it is at least 60 to 90 for the similar amount of energy. So it's a more cost competitive source of energy in the long run, as these technologies are now quickly developing. And this can even be proven with some of the latest renewable projects that are developed, you know, like what Scatec is doing in South Africa, for example. We see that this cost is already coming down to a level that is actually very, not only competitive, but by far cheaper than similar projects based on fossil fuel.
Thank you, Jarand. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but I want to give Elise the floor. We strayed deep into energy territory, which is not surprising because it is one of the most central issues, right, vis-a-vis any kind of sustainable growth and sustainable transition. But before we continue on that point, and there are a couple of things I want to follow up on, Elise, I'd like to bring it back to the original question around how does Africa actually go about using COP27 to address some of the issues we've discussed. So making sure that it isn't frog marched into, as Sanjeev put it, into another sort of undesirable situation, or, you know, sort of forced into a narrative and down a path that is just not going to work out for the continent. You know, what would you say is important to actually make this happen?
Yeah, thanks. Also have a lot to say on what Jorand and Sanjeev said, but I'll keep that for a bit later. But on the question, just I think, so if we look at the negotiation power within the countries going into COP, I think if we talk about an Africa climate agenda, I mean, this is great. This should be happening, yes, but can it happen? I think is a question that remains unanswered, because some countries will be able to push their agendas. I mean, they have the necessary negotiation skills, they have the capacity to do that. But an African climate agenda, you know, this is unlikely, because I think different levels of negotiation power sits with different countries, and there is a lack of a clear agenda on the continent. I mean, my opinion. But what would be great to see, I think, in COP is if Africa pushes its own agenda on, and even if countries pushes their own agenda on adaptation and mitigation. So keep pushing adaptation financing. I mean, that's vital for building resilience in Africa. It would be very, very nice, and here I agree with Sanjeev, to see a balanced approach between climate commitments that Africa makes on the one hand, but also the development aspirations on the other hand, and using the resources to its disposal to be able to gain on those development aspirations. So there will be a lot of talk on the energy transition, but I think Africa needs targeted global support and commitment. First, in ensuring there's energy access on the continent, which is, I mean, where is it? 55% currently. So that needs a lot of work in its own. I think a little bit more attention also towards the fact that this the continent is rapidly growing. So we're outpacing ourselves in terms of just population growth. A lot of this is still towards urban spaces. So we're seeing this urban transition, cities growing. So there should be a lot of talk around cities, sustainable cities. How do we foster that growth within cities? So that should also focus, I think, much more. And then, of course, I mean, what would be great and what would actually take it past just negotiations and talks is if there's bankable climate projects that's brought to the table, you know, well-structured projects that's planned, that they can put down and say, this is what we need finance for. We've planned it out. This is where we're heading. So I think that would have made, or that would make it successful, and that would, that would shape it, and we'll see real change. But on the energy specific question, we'll get back to.
Thank you, Elise. Now, yeah, back to energy, because that's obviously a big one here. So what I'm hearing is extremely compelling. It sounds amazing. And the idea that, you know, Africa can, not only can it do renewables, actually it's one of the best, if not the best places in the world to do renewables. And if you have the right strategy, if you have the right projects, you can do some extraordinary things. Jorand, you've highlighted how technology is shifting and changing, and in a decade from now, you know, fossil fuels and gas aren't going to be the game anymore. It's going to be all about renewables. So why then, if there is this opportunity, why then are we constantly bombarded with statistics and sort of, you know, perspectives that reinforce this idea that Africa renewables doesn't really make sense, you know? So for example, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, only 2% of financing for renewables goes to Africa. Only around 3% of renewable capacity is installed on the continent. And perhaps Sanjeev and Jorand, to you, when you have conversations with prospective investors or with governments, like what is the pushback in terms of renewables? What's the argument that says, no, you know, this can't be done, or we can't do this? And maybe Sanjeev, you get your thoughts on that first, and then we can bring in the others as well.
Yeah, should I start?
Yeah, Jorand, go for it, and then we'll bring in Sanjeev.
Okay, no. I think very many people have kind of outdated figures. They still think that, you know, if you just, let's say you want to supply a city in Africa with power, some people think it's still less expensive to build a gas-fired power plant, feed it with gas, and feed the population with that power. But it is actually not right. Of course, a little bit depending on the monsoon time, etc., which is not really that big problem in Africa like it is in India, etc. But most places it is by far more competitive, just purely from economics, to invest in renewables actually. But many people don't know that. They haven't seen the recent statistics on this, you know. So this is one thing about financing in Africa. I think unfortunately over the last 15 years it's been less popular for investment firms, the big firms in New York, etc., to finance projects in Africa because of the ESG, the increased ESG concern about, you know, everything related to corruption, etc. It's so big risk then to do a lot of financing in Africa. So why do that when we have more than enough, for example, opportunities within fossil fuel in America? So a lot of the investments has gone. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, Africa was the growth area for oil and gas. But then after the shale revolution, the growth was turned to America. And with increased focus on, and with some scandals, etc., related to corruption and things like that, people became very afraid to do financing in Africa. But Russians and Chinese players, they are much more willing to kind of do all this financing. So I think it's very unfortunate that we have kind of scared away investors also from Africa, from I think the wrong reasons, and so maybe governments should be finding ways to make it to lower the hurdle for financing in Africa also. So I think it's a combination of those two factors.
Thank you, Jarand. Sanjeev, your thoughts?
Yeah, Leonard, so, you know, in many ways, everything that Jarand has been saying kind of underlines the basic linearity of this argument, which one needs to understand, that somehow there is this idea that because technology is available, it is more affordable, the resources to produce renewable is there, why should Africa even consider going any other route? And why I use the word linearity is because, firstly, and that's a tongue-in-cheek comment, but it's also a factual comment, that let us not confuse the complexity of doing business in Africa with the complexity of doing renewables. Somehow the two are being colored up here. What I'm trying to say is everything that Jarand was explaining as a reason why nobody is investing in renewables is probably all the reasons why nobody is, or everybody's hesitant generally to invest in Africa in the first place. So let's not confuse the two issues, that the inherent risks, the inherent way of finding bankable projects, the lack of global investors' desire to work with established institutions in Africa and then making their own mistakes is a case study in itself. So let's leave that aside. Let's just go back then to the affordability question, that where the hesitancy, and I think that word was used by Jarand, there's that he sees hesitancy. It's not hesitancy. If you look at any country today in Africa, you have a huge fiscal challenge. You have a huge issue with creating infrastructure that was not built with resilience in mind. So resilience prop-up has to happen. On top, you have to build infrastructure in the first place, which doesn't exist, be it roads, ports, railroads. And then this recent food crisis and inflation means that there is another pressure on the fiscus. Now, amidst all this, the lack of global pledges, which in itself is not adequate to change Africa's energy problem or solve Africa's energy problem, in any case, it's not adequate and it's not forthcoming, puts African governments between a rock and a hard place, because it is not able to find funding to invest in its own fossil fuels, which could then be a ready way for them to earn money, to then spend on the priorities that the countries have, and waiting for deliverance, which doesn't arrive. And that is why the linearity of this argument that renewable is cheaper, technology is available, battery is available, don't worry about storage, is really looking at it very narrowly. There is a whole host of issues which needs to be considered as to why, therefore, there is this perception, and I use the word perception, that Africa is somehow rejecting the climate agenda. They're not. We are getting more effective than anybody else. We are doing much more. But the ability of governments, especially democratically elected governments, which is the way we want to keep it. Remember, we don't want riots on the streets and we don't want autocracies. For them to be able to be in charge of their own destiny, there has to be a more balanced approach. And I'll just end by saying this, Landry, that where it confuses us or frustrates us, or probably even in certain times makes us angry, is that everywhere in the world, they are not suffering from the tyranny of the or. They are enjoying the luxury of the and. I mean, even your EU climate chief at the start of the Russian-Ukraine war said it's okay to burn coal for some time more. All your global banks have funded more fossil fuel projects in the last year alone than they have done in the year before. So nobody is saying no to fossil fuels. So what did we do wrong here? Especially when we are not emitting it. And this whole manufacturing-based story, I buy. We obviously want Africa to stop being a primary producer, exporter of primary products, and add value and industrialize. But for that, we need energy. Even energy in itself, batteries need battery minerals. We need to mine them in Africa. So that's why I use the word linearity to explain to your audience that can we please look at it holistically? Because there's 2 billion people's future at stake here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Kimberly and Elise, I mean, there's no shortage of issues to pick up on here. I'll just give the floor to you. Where would you like to come in? What would you like to comment on or compliment or disagree with?
I think I just want to add to that to say that we need to realize that the African population, like I said, it will double in the next 3 decades. And it's already a continent that is energy poor. So the demand is very huge and it is growing, and it's growing rapidly so. So there's investment needed. I mean, that's not disputed. I mean, it would be ideal if that investment is underpinned by a green transition. And there's lots of potential because the infrastructure still needs to be developed. So if you get that development from the start right, you score a lot of points down the line, and we can learn from other countries that's been further down the line. But I don't think leapfrogging does not mean jumping directly from where we are now to just renewable energy mix, because the energy mix does not look like that right now. It does not look like that. It is severely fossil fuel dependent. And even with renewable energies coming onto the scene, it takes a long time for that to penetrate into the governments. It needs investments. It needs to penetrate in. And the problem, I think, as well, is that for investment to happen, you need stable governments. You need high governance standards, and you need strong institutions. Things that's not in all the African countries, which means you cannot leapfrog it in. You can maybe leapfrog in the sense that you maybe speed up the development process, but you cannot completely jump over a couple of decades of development. But that is my that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Thanks. So maybe I'll just compliment. I agree with everything that's been said. Just a few figures I was looking at before this panel. The Climate Policy Initiative flags that in the next decade, so between 2020 to 2030, Africa's climate finance needs are in the order of $250 billion. And then yet in 2020, the total amount of both private and public climate finance going into Africa was around 30 billion. So we're quite some way off, which I think everyone on the panel has made really clear. There's this huge opportunity. The finance isn't flowing. It is both a question of that 100 billion not coming through. Sanjeev is right, there are consistently being shortfalls on public funding promises. But I think one of the big questions is, and sort of one of the interesting things that I'm seeing more and more discussed is, and Darren raised this, is where is the private capital and what opportunities are we missing? Because so many ESG funds or ESG labeled funds are frankly just going into developed economies. And we're missing this opportunity to invest in Africa, but the opportunity isn't just kind of going to happen alone for the reasons that Elise mentioned, is that there are both chronic and acute challenges holding back that investment. And I think we need to sit down and have a really frank conversation on who needs to do what. Where do multilateral banks need to de-risk? Where do we use some of the public funding to de-risk and incentivize private funding coming in? Where do we need to have conversations about getting that more stable regulatory environment that Elise was talking about? So where it's not all economies, but where some countries do not have stable climate policies, do not have a clear energy transition framework, get that in place so that the investor can see the plan. So it's not about leapfrogging straight away, but we understand what is the trajectory. And importantly, at the WEF, we're doing some work with investment promotion agencies. Let's make sure that IPAs within countries are offering, where they do offer red carpet services or where they do offer incentives, that they're offering those to renewable energy projects and green and transition initiatives. So I think that's kind of a real opportunity to show and for countries to kind of roll out their toolbox and say, look, hey, we're open for business, and we're keen to attract this kind of capital.
Thank you. Just staying on this issue of the fiscal constraints, and those are no joke, because both domestically, even pre-COVID, a lot of governments they had very little fiscal room to drive sort of critical investment. That's basically gone now, and a lot of countries are struggling with debt, and that's a worsening situation. And of course, globally now, we're seeing a fiscal environment that is becoming less and less conducive to attracting the capital that's needed. Also, I think it's been rightly pointed out that we keep talking about this $100 billion pledge, which, even if it materializes, is really a proverbial drop in the ocean in terms of what's needed. So, this sounds very concerning in terms of what happens over the next decade or two, because if that capital doesn't start flowing, all of these conversations we're having here will remain conceptual and theoretical. How concerned are you, and this is a general question to the panel, how concerned are you that this is just not going to happen because the money is not going to be forthcoming, either globally or domestically, because it can't be mobilized? Who would like to tackle that one?
So I could have a little dab at it, Landry, if that's okay.
Go for it.
So essentially, and I think the point was made probably by Alice, I can't recall, and that is something that we have to admit, that as a continent, we have to significantly enhance our own ability to provide the environment for bankable projects to happen. That's our responsibility, right? That's nobody else's responsibility. To a large extent, a lot of the institutions, one of which I'm part of, do that. And our own financial track record tells you that we've done it well. But if you think $100 billion is a drop in the ocean, what we have done is a drop in that drop, right? So, because the extent to which we need to do it is a multiple of what we have done so far. So the point I'm trying to make, therefore, is that in our own experience, in my own experience, if we can do the hard work of knocking heads together, creating the legislative environment for projects to happen, the tariff structures to be documented and signed up, and if we can take the pain to finance what we call the project development phase, we have not had a problem attracting funding after that, right? So in many ways, the onus is on us, that must be understood. But however, so to that extent, I am not worried, because really speaking, while the problem is huge, there is only so much you can do at any period in time. And for that, there is money available. But the problem is that with this agenda on climate, renewables, net zero, very often we seem to get almost flogged by all kinds of agendas. On one hand, you have the rating agencies which flog you by saying, what's your carbon footprint? On the other hand, you have global banks which are investing fossil fuel projects in their own countries flog you, saying we are not going to do it outside our own countries. Then you have the DFI community, which has a big role to play, because they can give you the concessionary blended solution to make projects affordable. They are under pressure from their governments to ask for questions or answers to questions that we haven't even started thinking of, right? So the practical problem arises from there. And if there is one pushback, and I want to use the word pushback a little carefully, because that usually signifies aggression, but I mean it in a more logical way, that if there's one pushback we do need to give, is something I think Kimberly hinted on as well, that how can we make it a little more pragmatic? How can we look at it as a 30-year problem than a 5-year problem to be solved in the next 5 years? Because, I joke about it, but I think we forget one thing, Landry, that the world is talking about net zero, right? But somehow Africa is being asked to do gross zero, and it doesn't work like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Yaron, do you want to? No.
I just think it's very important. I very much support what Sanjay is saying. Just make investable projects, bankable projects. I mean, and then a lot of money will come. Actually, I see huge opportunities for Africa for the next decades. Yes, on oil and gas, short term, and on renewables, longer term, with really global competitive projects. So, but then you need just a healthy investment environment. You need the institutions to work, the trust in the legal system. You know, that the concessions are not kind of victims of some kind of regime changes, etc., that people have some bad experiences from. And then on the technology side, I think we need to be not ideologic, you know, not in any other ways for Africa. We just need to find the best, the most, the cheapest, the long-term cheapest projects. And just my point is that then it's under-communicated, actually, the competitiveness of renewables. And there's so much innovation also happening now. So in so many cases, it will actually be as I said, the best and cheapest project, not because it's climate friendly, but basically because it's just a better technology. Luckily, we are in this situation. And I think the best is to let the market work. The only thing we need globally is some kind of carbon taxes that should be adapted to each region. Maybe $150 in Europe, maybe 100 in the Americas, and maybe 20 or 30 in Africa. But that would be incentives also for the industries to do the decarbonization. But except from that, markets and technologies will actually fix a lot of these problems. But too much governmental kind of promises and pledges make actually people sit on the fence rather than investing, because they're waiting for maybe some kind of governmental support or international organization support, etc. So sometimes that does more damage than it helps actually countries, because, as I said, purely for economic business reasons, it's a lot of good investment opportunities in Africa.
Thank you. We are almost out of time. We have 2 minutes left. In those 2 minutes, does anybody want to make any final comments, observations, any pressing issues you want to get out before we wrap up? No? Okay, good. Everyone's satisfied. Thank you so much. We do have to wrap up. Great discussion. I remember a time, and it's not long ago, when the energy discussion around Africa was always the least interesting discussion, because it was always just oil and gas projects. It's fascinating to see how quickly that has changed. Tremendously exciting time. The potential is huge. We agree on that. But I remain a little bit skeptical, because we talk a lot about potential. Realizing it is easier said than done. And the way things are going globally at the moment, I would say vigilance is key, because nothing can be taken for granted. If the last 2 years have taught us anything, it's that. Going into COP27, those of you who will be in Sharm El-Sheikh, I have no doubt you'll be taking the message with you and preaching the gospel. Hopefully you could convert the people who matter. Thank you so much. And, you know, let's see what comes out of COP27, and hopefully, Africa can become not just a place that makes sense in terms of renewable investment and industrial hubs of the future, but the place to do it. And on that note, thanks so much. And thanks so much for all of you who've tuned in. And I hope you have a good and productive rest of the day.
Thank you.
And
bye-bye.